The first thing that woke me up was the sound, not a car alarm, not kids yelling, a clean, brutal crack like a baseball bat against glass. And when I opened the back door, there she was, standing over the satellite dish on my porch with a hammer in her hand, and the look of a woman who thinks rules are a weapon. That was Evelyn Pierce, HOA president, heels in grass, face the color of someone who'd rehearsed indignation in front of a mirror, and she was smashing something that, as it turned out, was federal property. I remember thinking, very quietly, that if you want to see a person at full tilt, watch them break what they shouldn't and then try to make it someone else's fault. I'll tell you from the start, I'm not the yelling type. I don't storm out screaming. I collect things, receipts, dates, footage. My name's Mason Hale. I fix radios for a living, and I know enough to tell what a piece of federal emergency equipment looks like when it's been mangled. I also know how stupid people look when they try to pretend there's a moral high ground while they're swinging a hammer. Evelyn stared at me like I'd walked into a crime scene and insulted the decor. "You can't park that here," she said, which was the first ridiculous sentence and the last reasonable one she attempted that morning. "This is a neighborhood. We have rules." "This isn't a parked car," I said. "That's a federal receiver. It's illegal to damage federal property." She laughed like it was a joke, and then, when a neighbor, Mrs. Duarte from 2 houses down, went to call it what it was, Evelyn flipped into performance mode. "I'm protecting our covenants," she said. "I'm doing my job." She tapped the hammer. "You people have been making noise, leaving doors open, and that unnecessary thing was an eyesore." Her motive was obvious if you lived here long enough. Control. Evelyn had been HOA president for 6 years, which in small subdivisions is long enough to learn every line of power and long enough to forget what people look like when they're not terrified of being fined. She'd been pushing a narrative that anything unfamiliar was a threat to the look of Ridgewood Estates, and anything that threatened her control, even a federal emergency receiver meant to route alerts in a real disaster, got called ugly and disposable. When the federal agent showed up 2 hours later, the mood shifted. Agents are weirdly good at making authority feel inevitable. He introduced himself as Agent Collins, clean suit, patient eyes, and he didn't need to shout. He simply asked Evelyn if she had a warrant, and when she said no, he asked her why she thought she could destroy government property. A crowd had gathered by then, phones up like little juries, and Evelyn's face, which had been practicing indignation all morning, finally hit something like loss. "You don't understand," she told him, the voice thinning. "They're eyesores. They're not necessary. They make people nervous. Heavy equipment's placed following protocols," Collins said, polite but firm. "Smashing it is destruction of federal property. There may be charges." I watched Evelyn's control unravel like ribbon. That's when people started to talk. Not the shallow gossip that keeps a community warm and petty, but the real stuff, the letters she'd sent threatening fines, the private messages where she'd called neighbors names, the times she'd blocked people from the mailroom because they'd disagreed. Her power had never been about beauty. It had been about leverage. And leverage makes enemies. There's a second thing people forget. Communities are small, but they remember. A week earlier, I'd found out my neighbor, Tom, had paid thousands to put in a privacy fence only to be hit with a deceptively worded HOA notice saying it violated aesthetic continuity. Tom tried to fight it and got bulldozed. He's a quiet man. Seeing Evelyn smash the receiver, something unrelated to his fence, a larger, scarier symbol, made him stand up. He handed me his old GoPro footage from a night Evelyn had been seen lecturing a family about their lawn chairs, and suddenly the room had pages and timestamps and corroboration. We called a special HOA meeting the next evening because Evelyn demanded it. She wanted to dramatize, to paint herself as the aggrieved heroine, and that's where the slow unraveling became a spectacle. People who had been scared to speak in the boardroom for years found their voices in the crowd. Anna, who runs the daycare down the street and had been fined for painting her mailbox the wrong green, read out the letters she'd received. Marcus, who fixed roofs for a living and had been threatened with a fine for a perfectly legal repair, showed the community the emails where Evelyn called him uncooperative. Evelyn tried to flip it, of course. "This is about order," she said, pacing the dais like someone in a courtroom drama. "If we let everyone do whatever they want, property values will fall and chaos will follow." "You mean you'll lose control?" Tom said from the back, and the room did something like inhale and hold. The line of power had never been about property values. It had been about dictating the day-to-day of people who had no lobby, no voice beyond a bitter notice stapled to a mailbox. That line snapped. After the meeting, people weren't content with a symbolic victory. We set up a projector in my driveway that Friday night and pulled up every clip and every email. Evelyn on a porch berating a young couple for repainting their door, the voice messages where she threatened fines, my GoPro clip of her hitting the federal receiver. We didn't edit to humiliate. We didn't need to. The evidence did the work. Neighbors, some who'd been silent for years, came with lawn chairs and popcorn, like they were at some neighborhood vigil for decent behavior. That's when Evelyn drove by and yelled, "You'll regret this." And 1,000 phones recorded her rage as only a small moment of human fury, not the start of anything heroic. But the drama didn't end with humiliation. Law has teeth, and so does federal jurisdiction. After the agents did their initial interview, the department sent a formal notice. Federal property had been destroyed, and an investigation was underway. Legal pressure, combined with social pressure, made Evelyn's lawyer, who'd been mostly an ornament when Evelyn needed a letterhead, nervous. The HOA board, sensing public opinion turning, convened and voted to remove her from the presidency on a 52 margin. The two who voted to keep her later told me they'd been threatened, and the community sighed, because being threatened is a bad way to retain dignity. The thing about confrontations like this is they always come down to a single moment where dignity and exposure collide. For Evelyn, that moment was in front of my house when Agent Collins came back with a federal notice and a calm, procedural way of saying, "You can be charged." She looked like someone who'd been stripped of the props that made her important. Suddenly, there were no threatening letters in her hand, no quorum to hide behind. She lunged not physically, but with words. "You orchestrated this. You people are ganging up on me." She called my collecting of footage entrapment, and a neighbor, an older woman with arthritis, told her to sit down or she'd be arrested for public disturbance. It was almost funny, the sort of small, human absurdity that lets you breathe after a month of tension. Yet here's where it gets messy, and why I'll leave the ending with a little fissure that folks can argue about in the comments. Evelyn didn't go to jail the way movies sometimes promise. She hired a new attorney who filed a countersuit claiming defamation, that the neighborhood had vilified her. Her supporters argued she'd been doing what she thought was right for the community. Some said the federal equipment was intrusive. Others insisted the federal government had no business in their yards. That debate split dinner tables and group chats, and it made the whole thing less of a tidy moral story and more like the complicated, human mess that real life usually is. For me, the lesson wasn't about justice served in a courtroom. It was quieter. I learned how easily people surrender their rights to the person who looks like they know the rules, and how dangerous that surrender becomes when that person confuses rules with dominion. I learned how courage is often just a decision to document and show up a camera, an email, a neighbor who keeps receipts. I learned that communities are messy, fragile things that need both bones and patience to hold together. There was a closing image that stuck with me. The federal receiver being replaced, shiny and untouched, while a group of kids not mine ran through sprinklers 2 houses over, laughing like they owned the summer. Evelyn watched from across the street, an insulated figure, and I thought about how often the loudest person is the most alone. The case is still technically moving through administrative channels. There may be fines, maybe an indictment, maybe not, and that uncertainty is precisely the point. Life isn't tidy. People don't always get what they deserve, and sometimes they do, and sometimes the only real justice is that neighbors remembered they could speak. So here's what I want from you. Tell me, was Evelyn right to think she was protecting something? Was it ever okay to take a hammer to something that belongs to a larger authority? Did the neighbors go too far by projecting the footage in my driveway? Or was that the only way to make a pattern visible? Drop your take, be blunt, be kind, be whatever, but convince me. If you've ever been on the receiving end of someone who uses rules like a sword, tell that story too. And if you want more, hit that like button, share this with someone who loves neighborhood drama, and subscribe for more stories where the small injustices meet inconvenient truth. I'll read your comments, I promise, and we'll see what happens next, because around here the ending isn't the last page, it's the first argument.